Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for April 25th, 2025. As many of you know, I've set aside Fridays as an opportunity to take some questions, and there are many questions coming in, but a lot of them this week revolve around the whole panoply of events that are shaped by the tariff question. The day of liberation a week ago when President Trump announced that he would impose tariffs that would liberate the United States from the unfair trade practices of the rest of the world. As we've pointed out, there's a problem with that assessment, which is that what he's talking about liberating us from are policies that were not implemented by the Chinese or the Russians or enemies of the United States that are external, but by internal enemies, namely the City of London oligarchy and their Wall Street accomplices, who are the ones responsible for the globalized system that has ravaged the American economy, as well as the economy of our European allies, as well as the economies of the global South. What we're seeing is what could be described as the end of history. And that's a reference to the idea that after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, the neocons, in their great wisdom, concluded that all ideological struggles of previous history were over now, with the triumph of liberal democracy. Now, the problem they had is, how do you defend liberal democracy? How do you assert a new imperial system on nations which don't want to be looted, including the population of the home countries that has been rising up in opposition to the political parties controlled by the oligarchy. And so the fraudulence of that idea of the end of history is clear if you go back and look at what Lyndon LaRouche wrote between 1971 and his death in 2019 about the inevitable collapse of the liberal free market system. So unless you start from that standpoint, you can't come up with a solution. And that it starts with the idea that the Bretton Woods system itself depended on what we call physical economy, the allocation of credit for the purposes of improving the productivity of labor through applications of new technology that are derived from scientific breakthroughs. This is the history of the American system. But not just the American system. This is how nations in Europe advanced at the end of the 19th century to overcome the power of the British imperial system. Now, the British imperial system did not let go. Instead, it chose during the 20th century to conduct more wars with the intent of bringing the United States in as the enforcer of the British rules. Now, this succeeded in the period after World War II, largely due to the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the shift from a physical economic system based on productivity to a looting system of speculation and financialization backed by militarization took off after the assassination of President Kennedy. So what we're seeing today is a continuation of that process, which was supercharged after the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991-92. Because at that point, the neocons asserted that there's only one superpower in the world, and that's the one based in Wall Street, Washington, with London as a full-scale partner. And over time, the incorporation into that empire of the nations of the European Union and NATO. Now, what LaRouche said from 1971 forward is that this system, to survive, would have to go to increasingly barbaric measures of austerity and looting, because it's not producing enough new wealth to keep tabs or keep up with the growth of population. Therefore, its leaders, tied to the British royal family, Davos, the architects of the World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, were actually promoting policies which they hoped would reduce world population. And we've been in that track since that time of permanent war and permanent austerity. Now, the problem in terms of the United States is that the American people have a sense of justice, even though it's been terribly eroded by the period of American imperial domination of the world economy. But it emerges when that empire turns against the American people, as it has under the period of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. And now we're coming to what may be an end point, a recognition that there's no way to continue rolling over the debt, the 37 trillion, of which 9 trillion will be coming due between now and the midterm elections in 2026. So it was necessary for whoever became president to try to come up with a solution to that. The solution they tried with Biden was to break apart Russia, to seize the raw material wealth of Russia, and to use the subordination of Europe as a partner of that, and to use the Ukrainian people as a battering ram against Russia. That isn't working. And the idea that a coalition of the willing in Europe could replace the United States to defeat Russia is an absurdity beyond even being worthy of discussion. Now, the other side of this is the attempts by Donald Trump to address this. Now, as you know, I am not a fan of Trumpology, either Trumpology 1.0 or 2.0. Trying to figure out the exact motivations and who's making policy is something that's beyond me. What is clear is that there's a fight going on, but it's a fight within the existing axiomatic bubble, which cannot be solved within that bubble, which is a bubble created by monetarism. It's a bubble that exists based on the post-1971 period, which defines economic policy as a realm of monetary policy, what's called monetarism, which LaRouche identified as driving those people who wish to protect it to increasing looting, modeled on the policies of Hjalmar Schacht, who was Hitler's Minister of Finance, who was placed in the Hitler administration by Western financial cartels. And that's what the fight is about. Now, with all the talk about tariffs, the talk about tax policy, the talk about labor policy, and so on, you hear very little said about the question of monetarism and the idea that wealth comes from the manipulation of money. That's the mentality of people, whether it's Besant, whether it's the hardcore Montpellier Society monetarists, or the liberal Keynesians. They're stuck in a realm of monetary policy, which LaRouche identified as the cause of the problem. So if you think you can cover the $9 trillion bonds coming due in the next year or so by making money from tariffs, or by cutting the budget, or by printing new money, you're living in the realm of the old system, which is dying. And that's why it's necessary to move to a new paradigm. Now, in the last days, this debate has taken up the form of a discussion of the Federal Reserve policy. It's useful as far as it goes, but it's not the solution. What Besant said, the Treasury Secretary from Soros, what he said is that the jewel of the U.S. economy is the independence of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is not independent. It's controlled by private banks and corporations. And it exists for the purpose of their private interests, their special interests, not for the sake of building an economy. So when you look at what Trump said about Powell, well, Jerome Powell is an idiot. The Fed chairman have a responsibility to protect the system of the so-called too big to fail banks and financial institutions, with the hopes that if they do that, maybe it will trickle down to benefit the average person. Now, Trump recognizes this is a problem, but the solution rests in going outside of the system. And that's where the potential of a normalization of ties with Russia and the importance of resolving the problems with China, which are problems mostly coming from the West, that those solutions, working with Putin and Xi, represent the way out of this to establish what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called a new security and development architecture. Unless you do that, you're not going to solve the problem. And to do it, you need to look at the one person who uniquely has understood this, namely Lyndon LaRouche, and his use of the Hamiltonian credit system, of the American system, as a prototype for how to solve this problem. Now, I'm saying this knowing that many of you are going to say, Hamilton, he was a British agent. He set up the original Federal Reserve. Stop spouting the history of the enemies of this country to detract from the accomplishments of Hamilton. Instead, read Hamilton's reports, his report on public credit, his report on manufacturers, his report on the National Bank, where he laid out a perspective of the government functioning to ensure there will be adequate credit based on the government, not private sector, to ensure a flow of investment in those areas of the economy which provide real wealth, that is the physical economy. And the people who slander Hamilton as a British agent or an architect of a Bank of England-style American system are deliberately attempting to destroy the legacy which made the United States function and which was adopted toward the end of the 19th century by most of Western Europe, Russia, Japan, and other countries. What you need to do is read Hamilton, read his reports, read the people who followed him like Henry C. Carey. Take a look at how the American system developed over time to the point that it was enabled to lift people out of poverty and build a successful middle class. So that's the task for us, not to stick within the limits of the existing debate, but to challenge the idiots who argue that we need to either cut the budget or just flow credit endlessly into the system. So I hope that this is a basis for you to take seriously your role as citizens, because if you understand anything about Hamilton and the Founding Fathers, their faith was not in a system, but in the potential of the people to come up with solutions to problems, and not the oligarchy, but the average citizen. And that's the fight today. And I would encourage you to register for our conference at the end of May that will be in the New York City area, where we will be taking up these challenges from the standpoint of outside the axiomatic structure, which is choking off any serious discussion. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you again next week.